Welcome to Go Reading Bedtime Stories, presented by GoReadling.com. Personalized education in reading skills for kids. Find a comfortable spot, close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let our story carry you gently off to sleep. Tonight's story is called Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, in a cheerful little village surrounded by green fields and bordered on one side by a great deep forest, there lived a sweet and kind young girl whom everyone loved. She had bright, curious eyes, rosy cheeks, and a laugh that sounded like bells ringing on a winter morning. Her grandmother, who lived on the other side of the forest in a cozy cottage by a meadow, had sewn her a beautiful red velvet riding hood with a soft lining and a big warm hood that kept out the rain and wind. The girl loved it so much that she wore it everywhere she went, to the market, to the village school, to the garden, even to bed on cold nights when the wind howled outside. She wore it so often, in fact, that everyone in the village stopped calling her by her real name and simply called her Little Red Riding Hood, or Red for short. She did not mind at all. She was proud of her beautiful red hood, and she thought of her grandmother every time she put it on, which meant she thought of her grandmother quite a lot, which was exactly as it should be, because her grandmother was one of her very favorite people in the whole world. Little Red Riding Hood lived with her mother in a snug, whitewashed cottage with flower boxes in the windows and a climbing rose bush that grew up the front wall and bloomed in great clusters of pink and red every summer. Her mother was a kind, practical woman who worked hard, baking bread, tending the garden, mending clothes, and keeping the little cottage spotless and warm. She taught Red how to bake biscuits, how to knit scarves, how to press wild flowers between the pages of heavy books, and most importantly, how to be kind and thoughtful toward others. Red's father had gone away to sea many years ago and had not returned, a sadness that lived quietly beneath the surface of their otherwise happy life, like a stone at the bottom of a clear stream. Red's mother never spoke of it with bitterness, only with a gentle wistfulness that Red sometimes caught in her mother's eyes when she looked out the window toward the distant horizon. To make up for the absence, Red's grandmother visited as often as she could, bringing jars of homemade jam and stories that lasted for hours. And when grandmother could not visit, Red and her mother would pack a basket and walk through the forest to see her. One bright autumn morning, when the trees along the forest edge were just beginning to turn gold and copper and deep, rich red, Red's mother called her into the kitchen. "Red, darling, your grandmother is feeling poorly. She has a cold and cannot get out of bed. I have baked her a loaf of fresh bread and a pot of honey butter, and I have made a jar of chicken broth that will warm her right through. Would you take them to her today?" Red agreed eagerly. She loved visiting her grandmother, and she especially loved walking through the forest, which was full of interesting things to see and hear and smell. Her mother packed a wicker basket with the bread, the honey butter, the broth in a sealed jar, and a small bunch of wildflowers from the garden, purple asters and late-blooming marigolds. She tied a checked cloth over the top of the basket and handed it to Red with a serious look. "Now, Red," her mother said, kneeling down so they were eye to eye, "I want you to listen carefully. Stay on the path through the forest. Do not wander off no matter what you see. Do not stop to talk to strangers. Go straight to grandmother's cottage, give her the basket, and come straight home. The forest is beautiful, but it can also be dangerous if you are not careful. Do you understand?" Red nodded solemnly. "I understand, Mother. I will be careful, I promise." Her mother kissed her forehead, adjusted her red hood, and watched from the garden gate as Red set off down the lane with the basket on her arm, her velvet hood bright as a flame against the cool autumn morning. The path into the forest began at the bottom of the village lane, where a wooden signpost pointed in two directions, left toward the mill and right toward grandmother's cottage. Red turned right and followed the narrow dirt path as it wound between the first tall trees. The forest was magnificent in autumn. The oaks had turned a deep, burnished gold. The maples blazed in shades of orange and scarlet. The birch trees shimmered like columns of pale silver, their small leaves fluttering down like golden coins whenever the breeze stirred. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves that crunched and rustled under Red's feet, releasing a rich, earthy smell that she loved. Shafts of sunlight slanted through the canopy, catching dust motes and drifting seeds and making them glow. Squirrels chased each other up the trunks of oak trees, chattering importantly. A robin sang from a branch above the path, its song clear and bright in the cool air. Red walked steadily, humming a tune her grandmother had taught her, the basket swinging gently on her arm. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes, deep enough into the forest that the village was no longer visible behind her, when she heard a rustling in the undergrowth to her left. She stopped and looked. From behind a large holly bush stepped a wolf. He was a big wolf with thick gray fur, a long snout, pointed ears, and eyes that were a startling shade of yellow-green. He moved with a smooth, languid grace, as if he had all the time in the world, and when he sat down on the path in front of Red, he did so with the casual confidence of someone who was used to being the most important creature in any room, or any forest. He looked at Red with those sharp, clever eyes and smiled, showing very white, very pointed teeth. "Good morning, little girl," the wolf said in a voice that was smooth and pleasant, almost friendly. "What a lovely red hood you are wearing. Where might you be going on this fine autumn morning?" Red remembered her mother's warning about talking to strangers, but the wolf seemed so polite and so interested that she found herself answering before she could think better of it. "I am going to visit my grandmother," she said. "She is not feeling well, and I am bringing her bread and broth and flowers." The wolf's ears perked up. "How kind of you! And where does your grandmother live?" Red pointed down the path. "Through the forest, in the cottage by the meadow, just past the old stone bridge over the stream." She realized, a moment too late, that she probably should not have told a stranger exactly where her grandmother lived. But the wolf was already nodding pleasantly. "I know the spot. What a pretty part of the forest that is. Well, I must not keep you. Have a lovely walk." And with that, the wolf padded casually off the path and disappeared into the trees, as silently as a shadow. Red watched him go, feeling a faint unease stirring in her stomach, though she could not quite say why. He had been perfectly polite. Still, something about those yellow-green eyes lingered in her mind as she continued along the path. What Red did not know was that the wolf was not polite at all. He was cunning and hungry and had a plan already forming in his clever, devious mind. The moment he was out of Red's sight, he dropped his friendly act and ran. He knew these woods far better than any human, and he knew every shortcut, every deer trail, every hidden path through the thick undergrowth. While Red walked steadily along the winding main path, the wolf sprinted through the forest on a route that was much shorter, leaping over fallen logs, ducking under low branches, splashing through shallow streams without breaking stride. He was fast and tireless, his gray fur streaming behind him, his yellow-green eyes fixed forward.
In a matter of minutes, he reached the meadow on the far side of the forest and the small stone cottage where Red's grandmother lived. He stopped at the edge of the trees, panting slightly, and looked at the cottage with those sharp, calculating eyes. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. The curtains were drawn. Everything was quiet and still. The wolf walked up to the cottage door and knocked. Rap, rap, rap. A frail voice came from inside. "Who is it?" "It is me, grandmother," the wolf called, pitching his voice higher to sound like a young girl. "It is Little Red Riding Hood. I have brought you bread and broth." "Oh, how lovely, dear! Pull the latch and come in. I am in bed and cannot get up." The wolf pulled the latch and stepped inside. The cottage was small and warm, with a fire crackling in the grate and dried flowers hanging from the ceiling beams. In the bed by the window, propped up on pillows, sat grandmother, an old woman with silver hair, kind, wrinkled eyes, and a quilt pulled up to her chin. Her eyes went wide when she saw the wolf. Before she could cry out, the wolf bounded across the room. But grandmother was quicker and more resourceful than she looked. She rolled out of the far side of the bed with surprising agility, grabbed a heavy iron skillet from beside the fireplace, and swung it at the wolf, who yelped and ducked. "You will not have me so easily, wolf," she shouted. The wolf, startled by her ferocity, chased her around the room, but grandmother threw open the wardrobe, climbed inside, and pulled the doors shut behind her, bracing them with her feet. The wolf tried to pry the doors open, but could not manage it. Grandmother was holding them with a grip of iron. So the wolf, always adaptable in his wickedness, quickly put on grandmother's spare nightgown and cap that were draped over a chair, climbed into the bed, and pulled the quilt up to his chin, arranging himself to look as much like the old woman as a wolf possibly can, which, frankly, was not very convincing at all. But it might be enough in the dim light of the curtained cottage to fool a young girl, at least for a moment. Red arrived at the cottage a little while later, having walked the rest of the forest path without hurrying, picking up particularly beautiful leaves along the way and tucking them into the basket alongside the flowers. She knocked on the door. Rap, rap, rap. "Grandmother? It is me, Red. I have brought you a basket from Mother." A strange, deep voice came from inside. "Come in, dear child. Pull the latch." Red thought her grandmother's voice sounded odd, lower and rougher than usual. Perhaps the cold had made it worse. She pushed open the door and stepped into the dim cottage. The curtains were drawn tightly and the fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the bed, by the window, she could see a figure under the covers, wearing grandmother's white lace nightcap pulled low on the forehead. Red set the basket on the table and walked closer. "Grandmother, what a deep voice you have today," Red said, tilting her head. "All the better to greet you with, my dear," the wolf croaked, pulling the quilt higher. Red sat on the edge of the bed. She peered at the figure and frowned. Something was not right. The shape under the blanket seemed larger than grandmother, and the hands resting on the quilt were dark and hairy. "Grandmother, what big eyes you have," Red said slowly. "All the better to see you with, my dear," the wolf replied. "Grandmother, what big ears you have." "All the better to hear you with, my dear." Red leaned closer, her heart beginning to beat faster. A terrible suspicion was forming in her mind, sharp and cold. She noticed the long snout poking out from under the nightcap, the yellow-green eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Grandmother," Red whispered, "what big teeth you have." The wolf threw off the covers and grinned his terrible grin. "All the better to eat you with." The wolf lunged, but Red was quick. She had not spent her childhood running through fields and climbing trees for nothing. She ducked under his reaching arms, grabbed the basket from the table, and swung it at his head with all her might. The jar of chicken broth caught him square on the nose. The wolf howled and stumbled backward, tripping over the quilt that had tangled around his legs. Red ran for the door, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Help! Wolf, help!" Now, it so happened that a woodcutter was working in the forest nearby, splitting logs in a clearing just beyond the meadow. He was a tall, strong, quiet man who knew the forest well and had heard rumors of a wolf in the area. When he heard Red's screams, he dropped his axe. No, he picked up his axe, and he ran toward the cottage as fast as his long legs could carry him. He burst through the door to find the wolf tangled in blankets and a brave little girl in a red hood holding a heavy wicker basket like a weapon, ready to swing again. The woodcutter was an imposing sight, tall and broad-shouldered, with arms like oak branches from years of swinging his axe. The wolf took one look at him and knew his game was up. He scrambled to his feet, shedding Grandmother's nightgown and cap, and bolted for the window. He crashed through it in a shower of glass and wooden frame, landed in the flower bed outside, and ran as fast as his legs could carry him, across the meadow and into the deep forest. He did not stop running until he was miles away, and he never came near that part of the woods again. The woodcutter watched him go, then turned to Red. "Are you all right, child?" Red was shaking, but she held her chin up bravely. "I am fine, thank you, but my grandmother is in the wardrobe." They opened the wardrobe doors, and there was Grandmother, still clutching the iron skillet, looking rumpled but entirely unharmed. "Well," said Grandmother, climbing out and straightening her silver hair, "that was more excitement than I have had in 20 years." Red threw her arms around her grandmother and held on tightly, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. "I was so scared, Grandmother. I am so glad you are safe." Grandmother stroked Red's golden hair and held her close. "You were very brave, my darling. You fought back and you called for help. Those are exactly the right things to do." The woodcutters set about boarding up the broken window with planks from the woodshed, while Red and Grandmother sat by the fire, which Red built up with fresh logs until it crackled warmly. Red unpacked the basket, and they ate the bread with honey butter and drank the chicken broth, which was still warm despite everything. The flowers had survived too, a bit rumpled, but still bright, and Red arranged them in a little jar on Grandmother's bedside table. The wildflowers nodded cheerfully, as if to say everything was going to be just fine. The woodcutter stayed for a while, making sure the cottage was secure and that the wolf was truly gone. He was a quiet man who did not say much, but his presence was reassuring, solid and steady and calm. He checked the locks on the doors and windows, brought in extra firewood, and fixed the latch that the wolf had broken. Before he left, he knelt down so he was at Red's height. "You did well today," he said simply. "You were brave when it mattered." He patted her shoulder with a big, gentle hand, and then walked back into the forest, his axe over his shoulder, whistling a low tune. Red watched him go and felt grateful. She had learned something important today. The world had frightening things in it, wolves with clever lies and sharp teeth, but it also had brave, kind people who would come running when you needed them. Red spent the rest of the afternoon with her grandmother. They sat by the fire, wrapped in quilts, and talked and talked. Grandmother told Red stories about when she was young, about the mischief she had gotten into, and the adventures she had had. She told Red about the first time she had met a wolf in the forest, decades ago, and how she had chased it off by banging pots together and shouting at the top of her lungs. "Wolves are clever," Grandmother said, "but they are not as clever as they think they are. The most important thing is to stay calm and think clearly. Panic is the wolf's best friend. Red listened carefully and stored every word away. Grandmother also taught her a new song, a funny, bouncy song about a rabbit who outsmarted a fox, and they sang it together until they were both laughing so hard they had to hold their sides. While they rested by the fire, Grandmother brought out a wooden box from beneath her bed and opened it on her lap. Inside were treasures from her long life: a pressed rose from her wedding day, a small painting of the cottage when it was brand new, a lock of Red's baby hair tied with a ribbon, and a silver thimble that had belonged to Grandmother's own mother. She told Red the story behind each one, and each story was like opening a door into a time Red had never known but could see vividly through her grandmother's words. The cottage felt like a place of deep, settled warmth, a place where memories were kept safe and stories lived on, generation after generation, like a fire that never quite went out. Red realized that her grandmother was not just telling stories. She was passing them down, trusting Red to carry them forward, the way the box had been carried from mother to daughter to granddaughter. Red held the silver thimble in her palm and felt the weight of all those lives, all those women who had been brave and resourceful and kind. She made a silent promise to remember every word. Grandmother made cups of chamomile tea with honey, and they drank it slowly, cupping the warm mugs in their hands. The fire crackled and popped. The cat, a plump gray tabby named Thistle, who had hidden under the bed during the wolf incident, finally emerged and jumped onto Red's lap, purring loudly and kneading her velvet hood with his paws. Red stroked his soft fur and felt the last of her fear drain away, replaced by a deep, contented warmth. She looked around the cottage, at the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, the row of jam jars on the shelf, the old clock ticking steadily on the mantelpiece, the patchwork quilt on the bed that Grandmother had sewn from scraps of fabric collected over her whole life. Each patch a memory, a child's dress, a curtain from a house she once lived in, a piece of silk from a festival long ago. Everything in this cottage told a story. Everything had meaning. Red thought that when she grew up, she would have a home like this, full of stories and warmth and the smell of baking bread. And the door would always be open to anyone who needed kindness. As the afternoon turned to evening, Red prepared to walk home. She did not want her mother to worry. Grandmother wrapped a thick woolen shawl around Red's shoulders over the red hood and pressed a jar of her best blackberry jam into the basket. "For your mother," she said, "and tell her I am feeling much better already. Your visit is the best medicine there is." Red hugged her grandmother one more time, breathing in the familiar, comforting smell of lavender and baking flour. Then she set off along the path through the forest. The sun was setting, and the forest was painted in shades of amber and bronze. Long shadows stretched across the path, and the air was cool and crisp with the scent of fallen leaves. Red walked quickly and steadily, not running, but not dawdling either. She stayed on the path, just as her mother had told her. She did not stop to pick flowers or follow butterflies or talk to anyone. She walked with purpose and determination, her red hood pulled up against the evening chill, the basket swinging on her arm. She passed the spot where she had met the wolf that morning, and she stopped for just a moment. The holly bush where he had hidden was still there, its dark green leaves glossy in the fading light. A robin sang from its branches, the same robin she had heard that morning, or perhaps a different one. Red stood there and thought about the day. She had made a mistake telling the wolf where her grandmother lived. She had been too trusting, too willing to see the good in a stranger who did not deserve it. But she had also been brave when it counted. She had fought back, called for help, and kept her grandmother safe. She was not the same girl who had set out that morning. She was wiser now and stronger. She took a deep breath of the cool forest air, nodded to herself, and continued on her way. The forest seemed different now, walking through it for the second time that day. In the morning, it had been full of beautiful distractions, butterflies and pretty leaves and mysterious paths branching off in every direction, each one whispering, "Come and see, come and see." Now it felt quieter, more settled, as if the trees had pulled a blanket of evening shadow around their shoulders and were preparing to sleep. The birds had mostly gone quiet, except for a single thrush somewhere deep in the canopy, singing its last liquid notes of the day. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and mushrooms and the sweet, faintly spicy scent of decaying leaves. Red walked and listened and breathed it all in, and she realized something important. She had always thought of the forest as a place to pass through, a pretty backdrop for her trips to grandmother's, but it was more than that. It was alive in its own way, with its own rhythms and moods, its own kindness, and its own dangers. It deserved her attention and her respect, not just her admiration from a distance. She resolved to learn more about it, to learn the names of the trees and the birds, to understand the tracks in the mud, to know the forest as grandmother knew it, deeply and truly. As she neared the edge of the forest, Red heard a soft rustling in the undergrowth and froze. Her heart jumped, but it was only a hedgehog, round and spiny and impossibly endearing, waddling across the path with tremendous seriousness, as if it had somewhere very important to be. Red laughed, a real laugh, the first one since the wolf had thrown off the blankets and grinned his terrible grin. The hedgehog paused, looked at her with its tiny bright eyes, twitched its nose, and then continued on its way, disappearing into a pile of leaves at the foot of an oak tree. Red watched it go and felt lighter. The world was still full of small, wonderful things: a waddling hedgehog, a robin's song, the smell of autumn leaves, a grandmother who fought wolves with a skillet. These were the things that mattered, the small, bright sparks that kept the darkness at bay. Red adjusted her red hood, lifted her basket, and walked the last stretch of the path with steady, certain steps. Red emerged from the forest as the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The village lay ahead of her, its windows glowing with warm, welcoming light. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the smell of suppers being cooked, onion soup and baked potatoes, and the sweet, yeasty aroma of fresh bread cooling on windowsills. Dogs barked lazy greetings from behind garden fences. The baker's boy was pulling in the striped awning over the shop, whistling a tune Red had known since she was small. The lamplighter was making his rounds with his long pole, touching each glass lantern into flickering golden life, one after another down the cobbled lane. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had always been, and yet Red saw it all with new eyes. The village was not just a collection of cozy houses, it was a community, a family of families, people who looked after one another, who would have come running if she had called for help, just as the woodcutter had come running in the forest. She could see her own cottage at the end of the lane, the climbing rosebush a dark silhouette against the whitewashed wall, and in the kitchen window, the familiar, beloved shape of her mother, moving about, probably setting the table for dinner. Red felt a surge of love and gratitude, so strong it made her chest ache. She walked through the garden gate, pausing to touch the leaves of her mother's rosemary plant by the door, breathing in its clean, sharp scent. She pushed open the front door. Her mother turned from the stove and smiled. "Did you have a good visit with grandmother, darling?" Red set the basket on the table and hugged her mother tightly. "I have a lot to tell you, Mother," she said, and she did.
That evening, after Red had told her mother everything and her mother had hugged her fiercely and cried a little, and then hugged her again, they sat together by the fire and ate a quiet supper of soup and fresh bread. The soup was her mother's special recipe, rich with carrots and parsnips and wild thyme from the garden, and it warmed Red from the inside out. She broke off a piece of bread and dipped it into the golden broth, and the simple, honest goodness of it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. The firelight painted dancing shadows on the walls, and the old clock on the mantelpiece ticked its steady, reassuring tick, the same sound it had made every evening for as long as Red could remember, measuring out the safe, predictable hours of home. Red was tired, deeply tired, but it was the good kind of tired that comes from facing something difficult and coming through it stronger on the other side. Her mother brushed and braided Red's golden hair the way she had done every night since Red was a baby, humming softly. The brush moved in long, gentle strokes, and Red felt the last of the day's tension melting out of her shoulders and her neck and her hands. "You were brave today," her mother said. "I am proud of you, but I am still going to walk you to grandmother's from now on." Red smiled. "I would like that." Outside the window, a moth tapped softly against the glass, drawn to the warm light within. Her mother kissed the top of her head. "Time for bed, my brave girl." Red climbed the stairs to her little bedroom under the eaves, each familiar creak of the old wooden steps a comfort and a welcome. She put on her nightgown, the one with the tiny embroidered flowers along the collar that her grandmother had stitched by hand, and hung her red velvet hood on its special hook by the door, where it would be waiting for her in the morning, bright and warm and ready for whatever the new day might bring.
Red climbed into bed and pulled the quilt up to her chin. The quilt was soft and heavy, made of patches from old dresses and curtains and tablecloths, every square a memory. Through her window she could see the edge of the forest, dark and silent against a starlit sky. The trees stood tall and still, their branches reaching toward the stars like gentle, protective arms. The forest was not something to be feared, she decided. It was simply something to be respected. It was beautiful and wild and full of life, and as long as you walked its paths with care and kept your wits about you, it would give you far more than it took. She could hear the faint sound of an owl hooting in the distance, a soft, rhythmic call that was as soothing as a lullaby. The wind rustled the last autumn leaves on the old oak tree outside her window, making a gentle, shushing sound. The village was quiet. The world was at peace. And as Red's eyes grew heavy and her breathing slowed, she thought of her grandmother, safe in her cottage by the meadow, probably reading a book by firelight with the iron skillet within easy reach, just in case. The thought made Red smile. She was the granddaughter of a woman who fought wolves with skillets. She was going to be just fine. Good night, dear little one. Sleep well and dream of forests full of friendly birds and paths that always lead you safely home. And that is the end of our story. Thank you for listening to GoReadling Bedtime Stories. Visit GoReadling.com for more stories, reading adventures, and fun learning for kids. Sweet dreams, little one. Good night.